We're talking about educational philosophies, and like all philosophies, they have a tendency to kind of change over time as conditions change. Technological advances have certainly changed what it is that teachers can do to provide better instruction for kids. The idea that I could speak to you today by video capture would have been a completely foreign notion to a teacher in the 19th century because the technology had not even been imagined there at that point in time. And so the dominant philosophies of education have tended to be very much a product of their times. Now, the dominant philosophy of American education, all the way up through about 1890 or so, was a philosophy known as mental disciplinarianism. And the idea back then was that if you want to improve your brain, you work it the same way you would work a muscle. So if you want a bigger muscle, you pick up some weights and you repetitively lift and do physical kinds of things, and over time your muscle gets bigger. Well, the idea behind mental disciplinarianism was pretty similar. That thought was that if you wish to develop your intellect and be a more knowledgeable kind of person, what you did is you memorized a whole bunch of stuff. Now, back in the ancient days, when very few people were educated and very little text material actually existed, few books, and most of the people were illiterate, those folks who did get educated usually were memorizing complete whole passages of things, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you can imagine that. But if that was the only book or one of very few books that you had access to, then going into great depth would be what one might choose to do. Well, in American schools, if you can imagine, at the time of great immigration in the 1800s, or early in the 1800s and 1700s, teachers were adopting a skill that was very teacher-centered, something that they could control and something that they could use with a large group of students who might have been at various ages. Graded education didn't really come in until much later. So the idea behind mental disciplinarianism was that there was going to be a lot of rote memorization and choral reading and things that people could do in a whole group. And that was almost a teacher's survival skill when it comes to dealing with large classes of kids in one room. Well, the idea behind mental disciplinarianism was challenged in the 1890s by folks that were, there were some big exposés done in the press where journalists went into schools and they kind of explored what the life was like. And what they found was class was kind of deadening. All this recitation, all this choral reading, all this stuff really wasn't a very stimulating kind of an education. And it also was all focused on the teacher, and progressives came to believe that it should be more child-centered, that kids ought to be doing more as opposed, with their hands, building things, doing more rather than just sitting and listening and responding. So progressives came up with this notion of the idea of making the teacher the facilitator and having the child be the center of everything that was going on. And there was also an idea that educated elites could then change institutions, that they could challenge problems that were seen in society, and that this kind of progressive action could actually make for a better place. The way that manifested itself in education was you had teachers setting up learning centers, you had a lot of choice that started coming into what people would study, and one of the problems with progressivism was it wasn't a singular movement. Usually when we think of a movement in history, we think of a bunch of people getting together to achieve some rather specific aims. But in progressivism, the movement was to not be involved in mental disciplinarianism, but the ideas of progressivism went in 100 different directions, such that each city would kind of have their own progressive plan. So the elementary school where I was had the Joplin plan that they followed, and another school would have the Gary plan. So, and these were typically named after cities where, this is how we do school here. Well, by the time we got to the 1930s, this notion of progressivism started to come under some challenges. One of the philosophies that came about at that time was known as perennialism. Perennialism had a pretty strong connection to Christian ideals. It was a moralistic kind of a thing. There are things that students need to know because there are eternal truths in life. There are ethical and moral principles that make someone a good student. So there was a lot of kind of underlying moral tone to perennialism. It was heavy on logic and the need for discipline. It was also a pretty teacher-centered kind of a thing. It had a strong liberal arts curriculum. And there were some famous educators who created a system known as the Great Books. Now, can you imagine as a teacher, if I were to ask you today to sit down and identify 10 books that you think every student needs to know because it will make them a better, more moral person? Well, that was kind of the idea behind the Great Books. Now, another philosophy, and one that did become more dominant, particularly in this age of reform, was known as essentialism. And it also was a reaction to mental disciplinarianism, and also kind of a reaction to this impulse towards social equality and the things that we saw in progressivism. And essentialists hope to kind of get back to the main idea of what historically we would think of schooling to be, to train the intellect, to teach discipline of the mind, to transmit culture. And this did, and similar to progressives, this was an idea that there was a critical core of knowledge that everyone should know. It was pretty teacher-centered. It was about lecture. It was about Socratic dialogue. And in the more recent years, around the 1980s or so, essentialism kind of became associated with a thing known as back to basics. And it was the idea that we should quit all these frills that progressivism came in, where you might have a course in witchcraft, for goodness sakes, as happened at Dixie Heights High School way back in the day, on the idea that if it was provocative enough and students wanted to take the course, then they should take that course. Well, the idea behind essentialism is, no, we're going to get back to some of the basic kinds of things that students need to know. Identifying literature and mathematics and sciences and history as being the kinds of things that everyone ought to know. And there was also an idea that through this identification of core knowledge, we would advance cultural literacy. Now, essentialism also came under attack because the kinds of things that were identified as core knowledge also tended to be very close to the old dead white man notion of history. And so there was some pushback that this idea of going toward cultural literacy was all about white people, and it left other minorities at the margins. Now, more recently, there were other philosophies that existed a little bit more on the fringe, but certainly came into play a lot more in the 1950s and 60s. One of those was known as social reconstructionism. And this is an idea that there are marginalized people in our schools who are not represented very well. And the purpose of schooling really is to help our students learn how to challenge authority, how to examine our institutions, and ultimately bring about social change that would create a more equitable society. So in a social reconstructionist's classroom, the curriculum would emphasize democratic kinds of ideals, where everyone is an equal. They would look at controversial issues. They would challenge what was happening in government and try to bring about a better society that would liberate all. And then finally, postmodernism, the most recent of the philosophies that has kind of come out and also exists somewhat on the margins. The main philosophy, I would say, is still largely essentialist. But this is an idea that America was kind of built under this notion that it was the best, it was the greatest, and kind of the only civilization of particular worth. Postmodernism takes a different view, and it kind of challenges the notion of Western civilization teachings that we all learned in school, and is a non-sexist, multicultural, non-racist kind of an idea. Postmodernists believe that students are prepared for global citizenship, and that any assumptions underlying social institutions need to be analyzed. There is no universal truth. Just because the government says something is true doesn't mean it's true. Reality is subjective. If I want to write a history because I'm a rich and powerful person, the history I write would probably be very different from history as written from the point of view of a poor person, someone who had been discriminated against, that kind of thing. So the idea behind postmodernism is that students have the right and perhaps even the need to question injustice. So those are the basic philosophies that we're taking a look at. Now you'll also notice a learning theory. I'm making a distinction here. There's also a learning theory that you will notice in your notes called behaviorism. Behaviorism is not quite a fully realized philosophy, and so it is not one of the 5 that we will be dealing with. But if you have plans to become a special education teacher in particular, and a lot of regular ed teachers as well, behaviorism as a learning theory will be very much a part of your life. And you'll learn a whole bunch more about that when you get to 219.